So now moving along to our next speaker, Tania Benade-Meyer. And as I've said before, I've known Tania for about 5 or 6 years now, and she's also one of these people who puts energy all over the place. So she's the CEO of a company called Motherboard, and Motherboard is one of these platform organizations that helps you with workflow and stuff like that. And I know her as the CEO of Unstructured, and she is one of the world's best experts in social media forensics, how you listen, how you can determine experience gaps. And she's going to talk to us about that today. Tania, can you join us on stage? Great to see you.
Nice to
And
see you.
you're going to talk to us about decoding experience gaps through social listening. And within the institute, we talk a lot about surveys not being enough. You know, I think whether it's CX or EX or DX or SX, whatever it is, we tend to go to voice of, and they tend to be some sort of ridiculous surveys that don't really give us a lot of information. NPS, great example, but there are others. And obviously, you've specialized in getting augmented information from all sorts of different sources. So I'm super, super keen to hand it over to you, Tania. I think a lot of people are going to learn from this. And I would just say, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so let's get everything set up. There we go. Okay, so what do they really think? So customers are talking online all the time, and how do we understand what that actually means for our business? First, a little bit about my history, as Alan mentioned. So I started my career in actuarial analysis, and that is essentially building models to estimate how much money you have to pay car and household insurance agencies. Now, this is really where I started doing data modeling and understanding what it is, but the insurance industry was definitely not for me. So I went to search for something else that sounded a little bit more interesting. And where I essentially ended up was in cybersecurity. So I worked at a cybersecurity firm, and I was very lucky that I was actually on the same floor as all the sales reps and the help desk. So this was really my first interaction with dealing with a large organization that delivers services, outsourced services. And my role there was really to automate the reporting, report on sales commission structures. But what I soon learned was that there was lots of data that was unused. And because I was in a very good position where I was talking to the reps all the time, I used to hear lots of customer stories, and I used to hear lots of sales stories, and I used to hear employee stories. And so I would come up with these hypotheses to try and actually figure out how I could help the sales rep understand why customers were saying no or doing strange things. And I came up with hypotheses. So at this point in time, data analysis wasn't really a big thing in the organization I worked with. So I would go with crazy ideas to the leadership team and say, I have a theory. I think we can learn something here. And because there was no one else doing it, they kind of gave me free rein to go and explore. So that kind of made me go into different areas of the business, establish my own department there where I was doing data analytics, go-to-market strategies, figuring out why are Australians buying from the American side. So doing pricing analysis and really understanding behaviors of customers, but it was all fed through talking to sales reps who were speaking to customers on the phone. And that's really where listening became a skill that I obtained. After a while, got bored of that, so had to move on to something else again. And that is really where I discovered what is known as social listening. So I moved to a company who at the time was doing social media monitoring and sentiment analysis. And essentially, we were just looking at what people were saying online, what the sentiment of it is, and reporting that back to organizations. One of the brands that we worked with, for example, was Adidas, and something interesting happened with them. So at the time, all we really did was say, there's so many people who's talking about Adidas online. This is the positive and negative sentiment. But when we started looking at the conversations, and this was specifically for the South African branch, I just loved reading the tweets and the comments online because South Africans is quite quirky and witty online. So I just did it more from an entertainment perspective. But what I actually then started noticing was these patterns in the conversations. And one of the things essentially was how the relationship was linked between Adidas as a brand and a marathon that was happening at Cape Town at the time. So the marathon had all these big sponsors, of which Adidas wasn't one. But actually, athletes and people who were interested in following these athletes online were always asking, what shoes are you wearing to run this marathon? And Adidas was one of the brands that was most mentioned. And so because both of them were our customers at the time, we were able to take these insights to the marathon committee and said, actually, the people who's running your marathon are all wearing Adidas shoes. They should be a sponsor, or you should collaborate with them. And that actually became their main sponsor. So we were able to unearth these conversations about different brands being in each other's space without them even knowing it. And that actually amplified. The marathon users grew because they were able to tap into Adidas space and vice versa. But that's really where I fell in love with social media analytics. That then evolved into something that we now call social listening. So before we move on into social listening, I would like to do a little poll. So how many of you are familiar with the term social listening? So never heard of it, no idea what you're talking about. I've heard of it, but I don't really understand what it means. I understand the basics of it, or actually I've used it before in my role. So if we've got some social listening people in the room, that would be very exciting. So we'll give a few minutes for everyone to give their feedback and see what the results look like. Okay, very interesting results. Okay, so around half of you have never heard of social listening. So hopefully today I can help you understand what it is and how it can help your business and understand the experiences better. 4%, you've heard of it, but you don't understand it. Hopefully I can help with that too. 40% understand the basics. You're off to a great start. Maybe I can teach you a few new tricks today. And then 8% have used it before and they're all awesome. So please keep me honest in what I tell you today. Okay, so that's our poll. Thank you for participating. So what is social listening? Essentially, it's just reading what people are saying about you online. And some of these times, they might not tag you in the conversation. So they'll talk about your brand, they talk about experiences in the brand, they talk about problems that they have, how they feel about it. And like I mentioned, they might not tag you. As an example, someone could be saying online, I hate standing in this queue at Barclays. They might not tag Barclays, the brand, and they are frustrated with it, but they could also be sarcastic. So how do you analyze that information and how do you actually amplify that and bring that to the brand and understand what the impact is? Now, if someone is telling you that they're standing in a queue, you can make assumptions. You can say, well, if they're standing in a queue, they're in a branch. If they are standing in a queue, there's 10 other people standing in a queue. So you can start using that information to build a story around how big is this problem that we are seeing. So not everyone might be online and talking about it, but there are people who is going to tell you enough information that you can make deductions from it. Now, this is what's quite powerful in terms of social media analytics. That's quite different from something, for instance, like a survey, where you can't really go back and ask another question. Because social media data is unstructured, all the information is there, and you can ask different questions of it. As an example, the Barclays Bank example, you can say which branch. If you didn't ask which branch in your questionnaire when you asked them how often do you stand in a queue, you can't go back and resurvey the same person. So that information is lost. You've lost your opportunity. But with social media, you can go back and structure and restructure the information in different ways, and you can change the question that you ask and get a different answer or validate the answer that you already have. So that's what makes it really fun to work with, because you can continuously go back and refine how you use it and restructure it. Here's a little example of someone that we might know that's in the room about how they were mentioned and not tagged. So Weston works at Unisys. He was on a webinar. We had a chat with someone and he shared that some of his favorite webinars, previous ones that he has looked at, featured Alan Nance. Now, Alan isn't tagged in the conversation. I don't even know if Alan knows that this post was written about him. But what essentially will happen is other people will see this and then go look at the interview with Alan. without Alan knowing why is there 10 people all of a sudden looking at this YouTube video. All of a sudden my views are spiking. We didn't market it. Where does it come from? The indirect influence has happened here, where someone has spoken about a positive experience about something that they've encountered without tagging someone. So all of these conversations are happening constantly online. Why does it matter? Why do we care? So this is a question at the start of my experience with social listening that we got asked quite a lot, is why does it actually matter? And so hopefully today I can answer these questions. Why does it matter? Why should we care? So the first example I want to show you, and this is related to what Alan mentioned, where surveys can be quite restrictive in terms of the information that you can get from them, but it can also completely skew the actions that you take based on the information that you have. So in 2010, the new health reform was introduced in the US. It was called the Affordable Care Act, but an act was, people started referring to it as Obamacare as well. So it basically was known as two separate things. And this was a survey that the Kaiser Family Foundation did to understand how people felt about this. And the question that they asked was, given what you know about the health reform law, do you have a generally favorable or generally unfavorable opinion about it? So already the language isn't really friendly to how you speak normally. So if we go and look in social media in terms of how people talk to each other, these are not phrases that they would use. So immediately we're not using human language, which already makes it quite hard for people to understand what you're actually asking them. So that might already have an impact in terms of how they're answering it. But what we can also see is that you have A or B, favorable or unfavorable, or unsure. Why? What has impacted you? Did you feel the same yesterday? Maybe I had a bad day, and or I tried to go and get eye screening done and I couldn't get it, so that immediately changed my perception. But yesterday I felt different about it. So there's the moment in time, this how you frame it, the wording that you use can actually give you quite different answers. But this is statistics that's been tracked over a number of years to understand how people are feeling about it. So we can obviously use the trends and see it's getting more positive or getting more negative. But we kind of did the same exercise, but looking at social media data. So we just tracked conversations where people were mentioning Affordable Care Act or Obamacare or healthcare. And so the results looked slightly different. What we found is that there was a grave misperception around Affordable Care Act and Obamacare because people didn't understand that this was exactly the same thing. And so what was happening at a certain point in time when Donald Trump started running for president is there was a big portion of his campaign that started putting out negativity towards the phrase Obamacare. And immediately people latched onto that. And what it actually did is if you had to do a survey and ask someone, how do you feel about Obamacare? You will get a very negative result. In fact, there was more negativity than positivity about it. However, if you would survey the same people and ask them, how do you feel about the Affordable Care Act? You would get a completely different answer. And if you had to ask them, how do you feel about healthcare? They'll be kind of in the middle. So again, depending on how the question is framed, you can get a completely different answer because of people's perceptions, how they're influenced, and also just the language that they use, which is really interesting. So social listening can give you people's perceptions. I like it or I don't like it. But they can also tell you why, because people talk a lot online and they will tell you why they like something or why they're frustrated with something or why they're struggling to do something. So it gives you that unsolicited insight into human thoughts, human conversations, their opinions, their intent, but also their actions. So we do a lot of intent analysis. So does someone, for instance, intend to cancel their subscription with Sky Mobile because they're unhappy with their mobile reception? Or do they have an intent to sign up with a provider because they're looking for a new CRM? That intent will turn into action. So there's always lots of questions about, well, do people actually do what they say? So let's see in the next example what happens. Using social media data in 2016, I correctly predicted the outcome of the US election and Brexit by surely only looking at conversation data online. And this is when people tell you that they're going to do something, they're showing an intent or a sentiment towards one candidate, or in fact, in this case, it was very much showing a sentiment negatively towards another candidate, where we looked at all this data combined and used data modeling to understand who do we think is going to win the US election 2016 or what the Brexit result would be. We got both right when almost all the pollsters got it wrong, because we just listened to what people were telling us they were going to do, and they did it. And so, yes, we couldn't survey the entire world, but we surveyed enough people to have a representative sample that could tell us they are going to vote, and they are telling us that their family is going to do the same. So we were able to quantify it in multiple ways. So definitely when people tell you something, it's important to listen. So those are a couple of interesting examples, but how does this actually apply in the business world? So another example. So we had a customer of a large coffee chain coming to us saying, people aren't coming to our coffee stores in the afternoons anymore. We don't know what's happening. We have free Wi-Fi. That's why people come to us. So why aren't they coming to our stores anymore? And they could see this data internally. So they could see that there was a decrease in revenue in terms of people purchasing at the store in the afternoon. They could see that specifically food purchases in the afternoon was reducing, and then the number of people coming into the stores in the afternoon was decreasing, and also the NPS responses was lower. So what does this mean? What did we do? So we just started by looking at conversation volumes, morning, afternoon, and we did this purely to make sure that we could match their internal data, because that's how you get people to buy into using a data methodology that they are not familiar with. Does our data match what you see internally? So just by looking at this, it matched. So we got some validation. What we then did next is we then looked at the conversation and recategorized them. So are people talking about food? Are they talking about the beverages? Are they actually talking about the Wi-Fi? Which they didn't talk about the Wi-Fi. No one cared about the Wi-Fi. But then we started noticing some other things like, I don't go to Starbucks because they don't have any gluten-free options. Or I like Starbucks Wi-Fi, they don't ask you a million questions. Actually, that was a lot less than some other conversations that we saw. Then we went one step further and said, okay, let's look at people talking about the mornings and in the afternoons. And what we actually found was that food conversation was more prominent in the afternoons than was in the morning. So that made us think, if people are talking about food in the afternoons, why aren't they going? Then surely they should eat there. That means that they love the food, right? Well, we went a little bit deeper, and what we actually found is when we looked at the sentiment about what they were saying about the food and beverages, is that the food variety was the only thing that had negative sentiment. So people were talking about food, and they were talking about food a lot, but they were actually quite negative. So this gave us a little clue about where we need to go look further. And then when we broke it down one level deeper to say, okay, what about the variety? What we actually uncovered was people were super negative about gluten-free options. Why? Did they not like the food? Didn't it taste horrible? What was the reason behind it? And what we actually found was when we went to the executives to tell them, people say that they don't come to Starbucks because you don't have gluten-free options. They said, but we do have gluten-free options. What are you talking about? Of course we have gluten-free options. But people's perception was that they didn't. And that was the complaint. I can't go to Starbucks because my friend is gluten-free. So that means not only can I not go, but my entire friend group can't go. So very super easy fix. The next day, what Starbucks did is they just put massive signs in their store to say, here's all our gluten-free fruits, because actually the little signs that they had was teeny tiny. So people thought that they didn't have it because they didn't make it super apparent for people. People would just walk in and say, there's nothing gluten-free here. So this was how they were completely blinded by why people weren't buying from them and thought that people would come for the Wi-Fi. But in fact, it was something that was missing within their organization, in their business, and their food offering that caused people not to go there. But this was an easy thing for them to fix. It's just by making it more apparent.
3 minutes, Tania.
Thank you, Alan. So, last slide is what does it all mean? Why do we care? So, social listening can help you spot the gaps about what people expect, what their perception is versus what they're actually going to do. So, they're not going to log tickets to say you didn't have gluten-free options, but they're definitely going to tell their friends and talk about it online. The metrics, i.e., decrease in footfall in my business, is not going to tell you the full story, but people's perceptions might give you some insights into it. And then the last thing is unsolicited feedback gives you a real world view of what those experience gaps are. And that is my story.
Just in time. How wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love this. And we've worked on a number of projects around this. And Tania is so creative. It's not just about understanding it, it's also about how you approach it. I remember we did one for a car leasing company we looked at. And by combining the stuff that the employees were saying with the stuff that the customers were saying, you could give a more complete story to the executive about what was happening and why it was happening. And in that case, if I remember correctly, what the employees were saying was mapping 100% to what customers were experiencing. So that comes a little bit back to what Cami said just now, that it starts with employees in many, many, many times. So this is super, and everybody knows I love Starbucks. And any Starbucks example is great for me. And just for people on the call as well, the XLA Institute is doing a project with Unstructured right now to look at the enlightened executive. How do we find enlightened executives? What do they look like, and what is their behavior like online? As I said, I think for us in experience management, but just broadly, the whole concept of social listening is a game changer. And the more you know about it, and nobody knows more about this than Tania and our team, the more you know about it, the more amazing things that you can discover.
Yes. Well, thank you for hosting me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tania, and we'll see you back at the round table.